Greetings, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burly-ites. I'll have a lot of political gravitas with our guests on the pod today, as well as what I know will be good humor and just a general dose of common sense and humanity. We've convened our premiers panel here for the second time, 3 former provincial premiers who help us sort through political issues of the day with the unique perspectives of having lived the challenges. Moving somewhat counterintuitively from west to east, because I'm in a counterintuitive mood today, I want to welcome Christy, the 35th Premier of British Columbia, Kathleen, Wynne, the 25th Premier of Ontario, and Stephen McNeil, the 28th Premier of Nova Scotia. And it's great to see all of you. These are, I want to tell you, 3 people that I have worked with and I have the most respect for. These are people who are highly accomplished at politics and governing, and really, really good people. So thank you for coming and joining me on the show today. Here's what we're going to talk about, premiers. I want to get your impressions about how the Federation's working right now, as well as your thoughts on the Prime Minister's major national projects approach to building the economy. We'll talk about internal trade barriers and why they're so stubborn, and your perspectives on how the Alberta-BC conflict might be resolved. And finally, we're all talking about these big issues, geopolitical issues, and how to deal with the United States. But on the ground, Canadians are obsessed about the cost of living and about how to get through the day with enough food for their families and paying the rent at the end of the month, etc. And I want to talk to you about what governments can do to help people in a circumstance like this. So, Premiers Clark, Wynne, and O'Neill, thank you for being here. Welcome back to the Herle Burly. And let's start with the state of the Federation conversation. So it feels like most of the Fed-Prov processes have been very hunky-dory since the federal election happened. And I'm curious from your perspectives about whether or not that's just the newness of it, in the sense that there's always a little bit of a honeymoon in these relationships between federal and provincial governments when they're new, or whether there's a change or a difference in the way the conversations are going in executive federalism in Canada. Stephen, why don't you start us off? What do you think?
Well, I'd always felt from the time that I'd been elected in 2013 that the relationship between the first ministers across the country, while we all came to the table with our respective provinces and views, the conversation very quickly turned about what was best for the country. I would say, though, over that period of time, and particularly leading into the last federal election, not only was the United States a major issue for whoever was going to form the next government, but as well, I hadn't seen the Federation as divided as it had been, and particularly Western Canadians who felt, they'd gone through a decade of policies that were impacting their economy, their livelihood. So when the election took place and the Prime Minister Carney was elected, I think equally as important as dealing with the President of the United States was his relationship with first ministers across the country. And I think he's done a great job. And particularly, these aren't 1 or 2 conversations a year, which often happen. And early in my mandate, the Prime Minister didn't meet with us at all. Then when Prime Minister Trudeau came in, we had meetings. But I felt, sense, and watching and hearing from different people that the new government has made these a more informed conversations more regularly, and reaches out and asks provinces who are impacted the greatest by some of the issues that are happening in the United States right now, what's your input? And then looking at the Canadian economy is recognizing it can't be federal government top down. It has to be what governments and representing their provinces believe are a priority for the economy, which will help build the Canadian economy. And I think he's done a really good job of managing that. Now, can he sustain that? That'll be his test. And quite frankly, as we see the next phase of these major projects, do they include the parts of our economy that were not included in the first round?
What do you mean by a more informed discussion?
Well, I think what happened was oftentimes, let's be frank, we have a first minister's meeting about healthcare. Well, a lot of that conversation has happened before we ever get there. I think he's calling, or it appears to be from a distance, I'm not involved in these conversations, that he's calling premiers further input on particularly policies, whether it's dealing with the President of the United States, how it impacts the auto sector, for example. He may call the premier. If in my case it may be something on the line of Canada, I should say maybe something to deal with seafood. They're calling, looking for their input as opposed to telling them what they should think. And this is what we need to, tell us what it feels like from your vantage point. And that's what it appears to be from this end. And from all sides, the premiers are embracing this conversation in a way that I would argue didn't happen in my time. I dealt more with regional ministers than I ever dealt with either prime minister in my time.
Kathleen, what's your take on the FedProv process right now?
Well, so the State of the Federation. I mean, I agree with Stephen. I think it seems like there's an increasingly collegial relationship between the provinces and the federal government. And I think that does, again, from the outside, seem to have to do with Prime Minister Carney's personality and the way he engages people. And I think that's healthy. But I would say that the State of the Federation, on the election of Trump, we got the elbows up, we got that kind of unifying force with a common enemy. But I think now, as we move into whether it's the major projects or whether it's the conversation between Alberta and BC, there's a testiness, there's an edginess that's coming in because the reality is that, we don't all have exactly the same interests. And I think that what Prime Minister Carney has done since he's been in office in terms of establishing some of those trusted relationships, I think that that's going to help. But I do feel like we're entering into an edgier phase right now because we're kind of seeing provinces being not pitted intentionally against one another, but just interests colliding in a way that maybe they haven't for the last few months. So that's how I feel like we're kind of on the edge of something that may not be quite as calm as we've seen in terms of those relationships in the last few months.
So last week, I promised you Herle Burly-ites a deeper dive into the benefits of sovereign AI. Our presenting sponsor, TELUS, you'll recall, just launched our country's first sovereign AI factory in Rimouski. It's a proud moment for TELUS and for people like me who cheer when Canadian business assumes the mantle of leadership globally. More practically, though, the sovereign AI factory is about keeping our AI computing power safe and secure here at home. Let me break down the hows and the whys. All computing infrastructure, data processing, and operations remain under Canadian control, supporting Canadian business in their AI computing, subject to our own laws and regulations. While that may sound intuitive, the reality is many companies operate and process Canadian data outside of our borders. And some companies may locate their operations in Canada, but their corporate structure and activities in other countries expose their Canadian operations to heightened sovereignty risks from foreign powers. So it may be subject to a different country's laws. During a time of heightened geopolitical tension, the added layer of digital insurance is the kind of peace of mind Canadians are looking for. A Canadian shield, because it's important for Canada to control our own digital economy that no one can decide to just turn off. Again, TELUS maintains ownership and direct control of all hardware and data processing within their AI data centers, critical for developing cutting-edge solutions in sensitive sectors. Banking, healthcare, or any business looking to leverage innovation and safeguard its AI computing from foreign sovereignty threats. Beyond just compliance, this is about protecting Canadian citizens' privacy and ensuring our innovations benefit Canadian society first. Christy.
Well, I think I agree with what both Stephen and Kathleen have said in large part. We have moved into a different era of provincial federal relations, and I think one of the reasons you're starting to see conflict is that we've gone from an era of performative politics, zero execution, and a government that really wasn't interested in economic growth to one that is very much interested in execution and creating economic growth. And so when that happens, you really do start to see those conflicts, political conflicts in British Columbia with an NDP government and a conservative government in Alberta, and also ideological kind of, direction that different provinces have. So I think what Carney's done is great. It's happened to expose these differences that weren't there before when the federal government wasn't really trying to do anything. And so, for example, the pipeline debate's a really good example. You've got David Eby. If you did a referendum in British Columbia today, I think you would find, given the change in our sense of destiny and our sense of threat from the United States, that you would get a majority of people in favor of the northern pipeline route that Daniel Smith is exploring right now. Would you get the government to agree to that? No way. The NDP will embrace that. It's core to their base, and they can't get reelected without it, given that they're already in a minority situation. But it's important we have that conversation. We shouldn't just avoid it. It's really important for the Canadian economy that we get something, another pipeline done, whether it's on that route or not. But the thing is that the way I think about Carney's leadership is that he doesn't see the federal government as duplicating all of the provincial government responsibilities, growing departments by 10 times as he has in some areas that are actually provincial responsibilities. He understands that his job is sometimes to bang heads together across the country, get the premiers working together with the federal government on a much broader Canadian agenda. So, I mean, I think this has been a terrific period he's had so far, and I applaud him for it, because it's not easy. But the actual job of the federal government is not to do the jobs of the provinces set out in the Constitution. The job of the federal government is to make sure the federation works to the benefit of all Canadians, and that's what he's doing.
But David,
Yeah.
can I pick up on something that Christy said?
Yeah.
And I don't disagree on the job of the federal government notion, but to suggest that the fractures weren't there before, Christy, and that we were just, we were going along, and because there was nothing real being done, we didn't see the fissures between provinces. I mean, I never remember going into a Council of the Federation meeting without Brad Wall being at my throat about, something around climate change, I mean, so in terms of the divisions, I just think they have always been there, and maybe they were less visible to the rest of the country at the time. I don't know, but they sure were real. And I saw in that period a federal government that had a plan and brought that plan to bear on the country. So I think that we have gone through a period where Prime Minister Carney has really worked, as I said, to unify. But the reality is that we have differences, and we're going to see them again, and that's what's starting right now.
Mm-hmm.
So in the first Trump administration, and you were all in office, in the first Trump administration, the federal government employed the premiers actively around the CUSMA renegotiations, or the U.S. Letnick was pretty clear yesterday that CUSMA is not a real term. Someone
should tell them that a sovereign country can't sign an agreement leading with the name of another country. This was an exact C stands for Canada, where we happen to be from, but that's just a technicality.
But when that renegotiation was going on, I remember that all of you were being employed by the federal government and asked to reach out to governors of states, to other players in the United States, to try to get them to influence Trump. None of that's happening right now, because I guess people have concluded that Trump isn't influenceable that way. So if you were a premier, what would you be doing? Would you just be watching what the feds do on the Canada-US thing, or is there a role for premiers still?
Well, I think there's still a role, and I will just say this, and then I'll be quiet because I'm talking too much. But In fact, David, the premiers started before the federal government got activated in the first Trump
Oh,
administration,
okay. I didn't know that.
right?
Okay.
I mean, we had our representative in Washington. I'm just speaking from Ontario's perspective now, but other premiers as well. We had our representative in Washington. I was already meeting with governors, and then Christy Freeland and the federal government came in. I'm not going to say behind, but they then became much more active. So if I were premier, I mean, Doug Ford's taking his own tack in this kind of offensive, but I certainly would think that we'd all have a role to play, because those governors continue to need to have a relationship with their counterparts in Canada. So I think that should be happening.
Mhm, mhm.
Mm.
The fact that the Trump administration has cut the funding for the Wilson Center for dialogue or between our two countries is going to have an impact, because the discussion between federal governments happens always, but the ongoing connections between governors and premiers is kind of intermittent, and it really very much depends on who's the premier at the time and how much they prioritize these matters. But those governors, those state senators, those state congresspeople are hugely influential in very many surprising ways with the federal government in the US. So those relationships really do matter. I will say, though, kind of as a subset of the negotiations, the softwood lumber discussion, I know it's not something that obsesses people in other parts of the country the way that it does in BC and Quebec, but it is going to be absolutely devastating in the path that it's on. And that's just kind of one example of where you've got an area of exclusive provincial responsibility, and a province that isn't really at the table to discuss it. I'm not sure how much they're engaging the Eby government in that conversation, and I'm not sure how interested David Eby is in that conversation, but it's an example of something where thousands and thousands and thousands of workers across the country are really truly in peril, the way that they are in the auto sector.
You would know better than I, Christy, but my understanding from the economists I talked to is that forestry and lumber have more impact on the Canadian economy than autos, steel, aluminum, any of these other things that are under threat from the United States. That lumber is, and I agree with you. I think 95% of Canadians have no idea that lumber is a big fucking deal in Canada.
It truly is, and those are high paying jobs. You get a good margin on your price. It's rural communities. It's Indigenous communities. I mean, in BC, many of these tenures are owned by the Indigenous communities themselves. So the total impact of forestry, as kind of a, in terms of on the average income in many of these communities, is very, very large. So you're talking about large scale death to a lot of small communities in BC and Quebec if we don't get this figured out. And those, again, high wage, high taxes, high benefits for all the other things we used to pay for with taxes, like healthcare and education.
I want to pick up here where I left off a couple of weeks ago. Our sponsor, CN, believes the most durable workplace arrangements are those that are negotiated in good faith between employers and employees. That seems pretty reasonable, doesn't it? In CN's case, that means the collective agreements between the railway and its unions. Both those parties understand the job of moving cargo. They both know the stresses and the sacrifices and the difficulties and the rewards of railroading. Their collective agreements represent consent, dignity, and fair compensation for an honest day's work. As a reminder, public servants have been sternly warned by the new clerk of the Privy Council that overweening process is the enemy of progress, that the business of government, and indeed the business of business, can suffocate under the inertia of endlessly proliferating rules and regulations and the blossoming bureaucracy government creates to enforce them. And that in these perilous times, we cannot afford such nonsense. Our sponsor, CN, agrees and applauds, and would respectfully like to call attention to a tangle of regulations imposed on the railway industry by the previous government. It is the very picture of process impeding progress. These rules, perhaps well-intentioned, were stacked on top of existing arrangements. All they did, though, was get between the railways and their unions, adding another layer to existing collective agreements, which, by the way, already contained agreed upon workable standards. These extra provisions have reduced the availability of trained workers. To be clear, this government intervention makes industry less competitive, less efficient. There's really no way around that. It makes the workforce less available to work, period. And that's saying nothing about the impact it can have on employees' hard-earned paychecks. Canada must compete in the global marketplace. CN respectfully asks government to let it and its talented railroaders do their jobs, and to leave workplace arrangements to company and union bargaining teams. Canadian companies are already facing adversity from abroad. They don't need to be doing it with their hands tied by their own government. This brings me to sort of something that I'm curious about as I've been watching the dance with Trump go on. And it is the lack of will to retaliate on Canada's part now. There was a lot of talk of retaliation early in this, and now there is no talk of retaliation. And I could believe that is because it's strategic and that we can't win a game of linkage ultimately, and Trump is so unpredictable that he could just kill us. I could believe that it's a matter of strategy, but I could also believe it's a matter of us not being able internally to come to the kind of decisions that would allow us to effectively retaliate. So I'm at the Eurasia conference yesterday, and Howard Lutnick says, we don't think Canada should be in the car business. We do not want any cars from Canada sold in the United States, right? Your car industry should be over. And, I mean, it's possible to say to that, well, okay, but it's also possible to say, well, we don't think you should be in the farming business in the United States. And so we're not going to ship you any fertilizer anymore, which is all produced out of Saskatchewan. But that probably wouldn't go over well in Saskatchewan and with Scott Moe. So what I'm asking is, do you think we actually have the internal cohesion to fight, or do we have really, Ontario's left on its own with autos and BC's left on its own with forestry and, and it goes like that, and it's not a Canadian response.
No, David, I would say to you, this is very different than Trump won. Let's face it, the globe had an approach to Trump one. We were all, it wasn't just Canada who was putting tariffs on them, it was the globe. This time around, the president, started signing trade deals, had different trade deals. And if we believe the rhetoric we're saying that the tariffs that the president's putting on are going to impact Americans, the flip side of that is the tariffs our government put on impact Canadians. Mm-hmm. And the other big thing, 85% of our trade is still going on. Yeah. So I think what the federal government is walking this very difficult tightrope right now. And quite frankly, the best part of what you just described, the prime minister hasn't responded to Lutnick like we used to do. Mm-hmm. Let them have their day in the sun and let's say what they want. Stay strategic about this, but this is now, how do we support the sectors and softwood lumber, which is viewed differently across the country? How do we deal with the auto sector? How do we deal with steel and aluminum? Those are all critical components that the national government will have to do and approach this in a sectorial way. I don't think there's division within inside of the country. I think Nova Scotians, and I don't want to speak for the Nova Scotia government, but I think Nova Scotians en masse support the auto sector in Ontario. They understand the importance of it for the Canadian economy. I think, whether the entire country supports supply management, that's another negotiation that would happen. But I don't think there's a division within inside of Canada. I think there's a different approach based on the fact that circumstances are very different. This Trump administration is not the same one that I would have been around for, where Governor Baker of Massachusetts, a Republican, was probably the leader in climate change in the United States at the time, other than California, with some of his aggressive policies, had access to that president. So this is a very different time, and I think the approach that we can all be angry, quite frankly, and Canadians should be angry at what's going on in the United States. But the Prime Minister has to be pragmatic. The Prime Minister has to keep his head about him. Can't respond to everything that someone's saying, or quite frankly, feel like he's punching back. While it might feel good for 30 seconds, this is not instant gratification. Should not be the play of the day here. We need to be long-term strategy. And while it may not feel it, the fact that I think we're moving forward, like our province, for example, the bulk of what we do is not impacted at this point. Because the bulk of what we do is seafood, or some auto parts that aren't caught up in it. So I think we just need to be mindful of this, and I just caution everyone. This is very different, as Kathleen would know and Christy would know, than 2018.
Yeah.
The world is acting differently. They've got deals all over the place. And that's where I think the biggest difference is that there's not an international approach to dealing with Trump 2 as there was to deal with Trump 1.
And I think, David, you're sort of asking if we escalate, could we come together to escalate the fight, right?
Yeah.
And I think we probably could find a way to do that. I think the way Doug Ford has been received by other provinces in terms of his message to the states and the accolades he's gotten for talking tough. I mean, I think they're, as Stephen says, we can all be angry, so we could tap into that in some way. But I really think that, the Gordian knot that would be created by, one-upsmanship on tariff damage, like I'm going to hurt you, and then you're going to hurt me, and then I'm going to hurt myself more. I don't know how we would back out of that, right? So I think that what Carney is doing, and he's taking flack right now for being overly conciliatory with Trump. But I think that he's managing a very difficult bully, and you have to look at, when you're in a negotiation with an irrational interlocutor, then you've got to be more strategic on your side, and I really think that's what he's doing. I don't think we can play a tit for tat game in this negotiation. It just will not work.
And the better choice, too, is the choice that I think they've taken, which is think about now how we're going to build our economy so it's more diversified around the world. How do we ship more lumber to China and less to the United States? How do we ship more of our uranium to Japan or to Europe, our natural gas? If we can, and in the process of doing that, build the economy by investing in infrastructure so that we, because the creation of infrastructure itself creates a lot of jobs, a lot of tax revenue. So there's another plan. It's a longer term play here, but I mean, I agree with both Stephen and Kathleen. I don't think retaliation is the answer. I think the answer is figure out how to do this better as a country so that we never find ourselves in the situation of almost total dependence on the United States market ever again.
Well, it was a conscious decision on our part to do that.
Well, not in BC. I mean, we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to diversify our economy.
But that period between the late 80s and the early 90s, when the free trade agreement and NAFTA were put together, that was a conscious decision. And since I'm as our friend Christy Mike McDonald says, I'm the last remaining John Turner cell member in the country. I'll remind people that in the famous debate over free trade, he not only said that political levers would follow economic levers and we lose sovereignty. Mulroney said, if the deal's a bad one, we'll just rip it up and get out of it. And Turner said, once this deal is signed, we're locked into this relationship, right? And we're going to be so integrated, we can't back out. So we've kind of fallen into that trap, haven't we? Where we got so integrated that they have all the leverage over us.
So we chose to stay in it. We not to stay in the agreement. We just chose to take that agreement and say, oh, good, this is all we need. when we always had the opportunity to ship more lumber to China, to ship more, to develop our tungsten and sell it to the Europeans or whatever. That we were never prevented from doing that. We got lazy and sat on our laurels as a country and allowed ourselves to become dependent on the United States.
I couldn't agree more with Christy on this one. I don't think this is an indictment of our free trade agreement. I think it's an indictment of the way we collectively have viewed our own economy. Respective provinces. Listen, David, how many times did you give me shit for going to China? To be frank, the fact of the matter is, it wasn't because I was flying first class and liked to be out of the province. It was to sell seafood.
Unfortunately, that's how it plays. But anyway,
yeah, but I needed another customer. I needed another customer. The U.S. was selling the price of seafood. Quite frankly, in 2013, I went to China to sell seafood, $1 billion worth. They no longer set the price, even though our largest single customer was still the Americans. To me, you asked about the relationship between premiers. Premiers all the time should be outside of their provinces looking for trade agreements, looking for partners, whether it's a cultural partner, whether it is an economic partner, whatever it is, they should be out on behalf of their citizens to do that. We all become comfortable with the United States because they're our cousins. Well, guess what? Our angry uncle now is in charge of our cousins. And that's our problem. We're saddled with him, but that's not the fault of that agreement. It's the fault of the Canadian economy and the Canadian elected officials during that period of time who haven't continued down the path of diversifying our economy. And if we get a trade agreement again and we fall back into the same old pattern, 10 years from now, we have no one else to blame. Mm-hmm. Nobody. And that's what I worry about. I'm hoping, and I said this before, we'll thank Trump at some point if we continue down this path of looking for other partners. They don't have to replace the American economy. They just need to give us another option to sell our products.
The following is a political advertisement. To build a strong Canadian economy, we need a Made in Canada plan. Public service workers power our economy. They support small businesses and keep our supply chain moving. Canada's economic resilience relies on having strong public services. To strengthen our economy, we need to invest in public services. Learn how at forucanada.ca. This message was paid for by the Public Service Alliance of Canada.
So let me follow up with this, because as you were talking, what I'm thinking is that, okay, so it is clear the objective of the U.S., and it's not anti-Canada, it's pro-U.S., because they're doing it to every country, is to maximize their leverage and maximize their gains out of every transaction that occurs. So their objective, to be quite clear, is to make us poorer than we've been and to make them richer than they have been. That is the objective of their policy. And Lutnick made it clear yesterday at Eurasia that that's exactly what their policy is.
David, can I just ask, do you think, so the second half of that equation, is it really about making us poorer? Do they care about us at all?
No,
or is it just to make them richer?
He said you should be happy to be second, but it's a zero-sum game.
Yeah. Right.
It's a zero-sum game.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
We should be happy to be second in their hearts.
Yeah.
So as a political exercise, so you're all expressing optimism that we can turn this around and we can find new markets and we can diversify and do all the things we should have been doing 20 years ago. And I hear this optimism from you, but that's a process and that will take time. Mm-hmm. And that will mean that we are indeed poorer than we've been for a period of time.
Yes.
That's an extraordinarily difficult political situation to manage. How do you communicate this strategy to Canadians in a way that keeps them on side?
So I think one of the things that has to happen is people have to, maybe know that the way you've laid it out, but also they have to know what the government is going to do. What is the plan to help people go through a transition, right? And David, we've talked in the past about how we did not, as a country, when we entered the free trade agreement, we did not have that transition plan. And, the David Orchards of the world were, ranting about what was going to happen, and it happened. Yep. And so I think that we have to be really clear about who's going to be hurting in which sectors, and what are we going to do to help those families to keep going? Make sure that they are not thrown to the curb. And, I mean, we can talk about what some of that might look like, but that to me is the task in front of us. If we really, because I think I worry a lot about how long it will take to get to this diversification. I mean, Stephen and Christy and I all traveled. I traveled too. We were looking for partners, we were looking for economic opportunity, but that doesn't happen overnight. There were some agreements signed, but it didn't change the economic realities of Ontario, my missions, And so it's going to take time. We need a plan for those people who are going to be most affected. And we need to be, I hope there's somebody identifying those right now and figuring out what the plan is going to be for those individual families in those individual communities that are going to lose their plants and they're not going to have the economic viability that they have today.
David, I think we are reflecting different parts of the country here for sure. And the great thing about the panel is that you really see the diversity of the Canadian economy. Because in BC, when I was in government, we worked hard to get our economy so that we were less than 50% of our exports to the United States. And at the time, we were the only province that had succeeded in doing that. Much, much harder for Ontario and Quebec to be able to do that. And that's just a structural thing. So very different kind of questions for the West than from Ontario. But I do think, one of the things the federal government needs to do, I agree with this whole spend to grow thing. Because I don't think there's any other choice. We have to invest in infrastructure if we want to grow and diversify the economy. And that'll create some wealth just on its own from wages, construction wages and the like. But I do think, though, that the federal government and the provincial governments need to start really getting focused on the way they get in the way of economic growth. So I'll go back to forestry as an example. We are getting just murdered by the Americans on this very lucrative industry. Meantime, the provincial government in BC has cut the annual allowable cut. By half. So, it's one example across the country of all of the things that governments are doing at provincial levels that have really slowed economic growth. We need provinces to get focused, not just the federal government, on the specific areas where they can really make a difference to spark growth. And the feds can't do that. I mean, they don't have a federal Ministry of Forests. I hope they don't anymore. We've got to figure out province by province and not just as a country, what we are going to be doing to try and create growth. Because Kathleen's right. I mean, we're going to have to increase the amount we're spending on basic social programs. But I mean, if you're not creating any wealth and people are depending on social programs in order to survive in mass numbers, that's a very bad place for the country to be.
I would also say, though, Christine, I'm now going to spending for the sake of spending, which we saw through the COVID period of time, where we didn't have any choice as government. So I lived that with no path out of it. Is not the formula to be using as we go forward. My hope is that provincial governments are strategically looking at what is it that will drive our export economy. How are we increasing small to medium-sized businesses' ability to diversify their export ability beside the United States? Are we supporting companies that are reinvesting in their own physical plant infrastructure through capital tax credits? How are we supporting certain sectors that have been impacted a great deal? There are other parts of our economy in every one of our provinces that haven't been impacted. So I think we need to be very careful about, because I think the next looming problem for this country is not just the national government's overspend. We got a lot of subnational governments that have massive problems coming. And I think you're going to see them in the next couple of years. And every one of them is going to try to blame it on Donald Trump. I would argue he's part of it. But there's some internal challenges that I think that's the fiscal conservative in me that says this has to be strategic in terms of how they invest. And it can't be this, we got a problem, let's write a check for it.
I agree with that.
I've never seen a situation where politicians had to say to their citizens, we are going to enter a period of decline, and we have a plan to get out of it. But we are entering a period of decline.
Kathleen laid that out for you, though, David. And I think we underestimate the intelligence of the voter. Yeah. They know we're in challenging times. I think a government across this country could tell Canadians, these are going to be difficult times in parts of our economy. Here's our plan. Here's our plan strategically. How are we going to find new trading partners? How are we going to build a Canadian economy? All of the things that will take time to unfold, but I think people will come with you. I believe that, and there's a straight talk doesn't hurt. People take it. I think there is a path.
I agree with you, Stephen. But okay, I'm just gonna use an example of. So there's a 43-year-old in an auto plant in Ontario. This is not somebody who you're going to just say you're just going to rely on social programs for the rest of your life in terms of an income supplement. That kid needs some support. And one of the things I'm really worried about right now, and this is Ontario specific, but I'm really worried about our deteriorating post-secondary institutions. So I'm really worried that what we are going to need is significant retraining programs for people who have lots of capacity and are going to be able to take part in the economy, but they've worked in an auto plant since they were 20, and they don't have the skills that they are going to need. So we need to make sure, and this has always been the case, certainly in Ontario, I think across the country, our educated workforce is a huge part of what makes us competitive to the degree that we are competitive. If we don't foster that and nurture it, we're going to be in deep, deep trouble. And right now, there's a kind of anti-intellectualism that's happening that's affecting our post-secondary sector and is going to make us vulnerable, because along with the diversification of the economy and the investment in infrastructure, which does have to happen and absolutely creates jobs in the short term, there are going to be a whole lot of people who need to understand what they're going to do on Monday morning when their plant closes. And if there isn't something that says, here's a path for you, it's either an internship somewhere else, or it's, the college that we're going to keep open instead of closing it is going to provide a path for you, then that person is going to be disenchanted pretty darn quick. And so
that's the fucking Tinder that led to the Trump fire.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? So let's talk about everyone's favorite topic, taxes. It probably never occurs to you when you're filling out your T1 every year, but tax policy plays a part in almost every business decision made in Canada, where investors decide to put their money, where entrepreneurs decide to start or grow their business, and where top talent decides to put those talents to use. But according to a report from our sponsor, CPA Ontario, 2/3 of surveyed chartered professional accountants in Ontario believe Canada's tax system is inhibiting economic growth. And 88% believe reforming personal and corporate income tax is important. Why? Well, consider this. Canada's combined corporate tax rates and personal income tax rates are higher than countries we are competing with for investment and talent. And the result, according to CPA Ontario, lost business investment, lost opportunities, and a stagnating Canadian economy. The status quo isn't working, but it is within Canada's power to change it. Tax Reform for Growth in Canada puts forward 20 bold, practical recommendations for reforming Canada's tax system. From modernizing innovation tax policy to support Canadian startups to improving Canada's business tax competitiveness, the decision is ours, Canada. With bold, urgent action, we can build a tax system that will attract the investment, entrepreneurship, and talent that will build a stronger, more resilient country. Visit cpaontario.ca/tax reform to learn more.
That's exactly where I was going with this, where that's why it needs to be sector specific, whether it needs to be, because it's going to have to be, how do we address with the parts of our economy that are being damaged the most? Canadians across the country would understand that if the leader stands up and say, the entire economy of the auto sectors is decimated. We have to do something. Steel. Listen, look at what happened, quite frankly, when we made half of our country feel that the resource sector didn't count, didn't matter.
Yeah.
There was a huge division within inside of our country very quickly. But Canadians, Nova Scotians, believed we should have an oil and gas sector. There's just no question we do. So I think that's where I think this, as opposed just a blanket spread the money around and run massive deficits, both provincially, and I'm not letting provincial governments off the hook on this, David, because they have a massive responsibility to strategically invest in what is the economic growth for them specifically.
And that's what I mean. This whole idea of building infrastructure, I don't think it is a transitory thing. I think that you build the infrastructure like we did when we built LNG, we built Site C. What you do is you create jobs from that are long-term jobs as well, because you're creating a whole bunch of industry and long-term through that long-term investment. So I see the Fed's doing that. But Kathleen's original point was, what are we going to do to support people through social programs because they're displaced in the economy as a result of this trade dispute that we've got with the US. And there are two ways to think about that. One is to just start spending more money on it. And the other is to go look at the federal government spending and figure out if we can spend less on some of the things that they do. So you look at, for example, natural resources, provincial government responsibility. The national budget for that has doubled. If you look at health, it has, I think, gone up almost 8 times, a provincial government responsibility. The federal government isn't delivering much healthcare, and they're not delivering any natural resource projects, as far as I understand. They have really no business being in these areas of provincial responsibility. So I think, one of the things we could think about is, okay, if you're going to go back to spending $1.5 billion on natural resources, which is what it was at in 2015 before the Trudeau government started, why don't you take the other $1.5 billion and give that to provinces to support social programs, or put it into universities and post-secondary, as Kathleen said. My point is that there's money that the government is currently spending that they haven't targeted for reduction, that they should be thinking about redeploying for ministries that are doing jobs that are already done by provinces, that don't need to be done by hundreds and hundreds of federal bureaucrats, and put that into provincial coffers so that they can be able to support people who are displaced. Some of this money is already there. So it's a matter of choosing what you want to spend it on, rather than having to take massive cuts for social programs, which, as Kathleen, I think, rightly says, we should be really worried about, because that's the direction we're going in right now.
We should be, but we need to be careful here, because this is so I would say to you what I think might be a more strategic approach by the national government. If it's an auto sector issue, there's a pay package or support of wages in that sector that keep these people doing something in that sector. Giving the provinces money to increase social programming, while we all want it, there's no way out of it for us as a province. We need to somehow keep these people working, whether it is subsidizing the wage package to help that company transition to something new. Who knows? Build something for the military. I don't know. But I just think when you say I'm going to keep that person whole by giving money to provinces who will then transfer to their citizens, you can't get out of that. There's just no path out of it.
You can transfer it in terms of in the ways that Kathleen was.
All right. Wait.
David, I know you want to get in, David.
Long-term
I just think we haven't defined our terms. Social programs, we're using it in all sorts of different ways.
Right.
And I think all of the above can be part of that transition plan. Okay. I wasn't just talking about a basic income, although I think, we should have that discussion nationally. But I was also talking about the kinds of investments, Stephen and Christy, that you're talking about.
Yeah,
okay, David.
Right. And now I want to turn it back on the provs, because this is, you started to attack the federal government. I'm going to turn it back on the provincial government, because all of my life in politics, I've been hearing people go on nerdishly about internal trade barriers in Canada and about how we need to have free trade in Canada, get rid of these interprovincial trade barriers. And I scoffed at this for years and years because I'd been hearing it for 35 years.
Because you're from Ontario, David.
I'm from Saskatchewan, Christy.
Yeah, well.
And uh, and then this all happened, and the new prime minister said, we can give ourselves more than they can take from us. Economists said, actually, removing interprovincial trade barriers could result in a GDP boost that would more than compensate for what we're losing in trade to the United States. And everybody was going to do this, and it was going to happen by Canada Day. And even though, the biggest lie in the world is this time it's different, I wanted to believe it. July 1st came, and the feds reduced whatever their role was in interprovincial trade barriers. Don't even know what that was. And then I've heard nothing but crickets about this whole issue for months and months. But I do know that I cannot buy a fine Okanagan wine in the LCBO. So I presume that this problem has not been solved. So what the fuck?
What the fuck? Exactly. Kathleen.
I'm going to invoke Jim Bradley, the recently departed wonderful MPP of 41 years here in Ontario. And when we would talk about interprovincial barriers, he would say, well, you're just going to have to talk to the winemakers in Niagara if you want to have that conversation with Premier Clark. So, they're all negotiations, David. They take time, and there's turf. And people don't want to give up on what they know and on the status quo. I think there are areas like education, because so when we think about qualifications, moving from province to province, it's all going to be a negotiation, and that's why it's gone quiet, because whether those conversations are happening official to official, they probably are. I know BC and Ontario have been talking about wine forever. But it's not as simple as waving a magic wand. And I will just say that I don't know where the numbers come in terms of what the productivity will give us. James Moore used to talk about 50 billion, and then I've heard 120 billion. I haven't ever seen a really decent breakdown of exactly how that money would flow.
Last week, we heard from our original sponsor, the Ontario Real Estate Association, or OREA, about the need to reform the province's rental housing system to rebalance the interests of both landlords and tenants. One way to do that is by creating modernized legislation for today's rental market. The Residential Tenancies Act, or RTA, is the legislation meant to set fair rules for the rental system to protect both landlords and tenants. However, the RTA hasn't been significantly updated in almost 20 years, and major gaps have emerged, meaning neither side is being well served. Queen's Park has signaled that it is open to changing the RTA, and OREA wants to see stronger penalties against those using bad faith evictions, more resources to educate landlords and tenants on their rights, and equal treatment under the Act that is inclusive of all families. To read OREA's full list of recommendations, offering a clear path toward a rental market that works for everyone, go to orea.com/fair rentals. Stephen McNeil, why did your government have different rules for trucks on the fucking highway than New Brunswick would have?
Oh, we didn't. We fixed that, David.
Yeah, we fixed that, David.
So, David, you should be paying attention to that's why
we did that. Brad Douglas was part of that. We did that.
David, how do you think I got reelected, David?
It was me. I thought I got you reelected. Anyway.
So listen, I think that what's interesting here, what we're leaving out of this. So I think coming into this, the private sector was worried. They were nervous about their largest trading partner potentially shutting them out. Don't forget, the private sector likes isolating themselves in certain parts of our country too. It's not just the government that says that has a role in this. The private sector, some people are benefiting from these regulations, whether we like to acknowledge it or not. I personally believe that's why we put in place an Office for Regulatory Reform. They made huge changes for us as a province. They're nonsensical. But you also have to remember, as Kathleen points out, a good chunk of this is self-regulated professions. They're self-regulated, Dave, for a reason. Government doesn't do it. Doctors, for example, nurses, lawyers, they're all self-regulated. In order to have labor mobility for those people, they have to agree. It was in 2018 we started looking at having labor mobility for physicians in Atlantic Canada. I think they finished it in 2018. Or sorry, 2022 or 23. Now,
But do we have that time in this circumstance? And can those kinds of things matter?
I'm going to go back to say to you, 85% of our economy is still trading. 85% of our business are still trading across the border. I would say the urgency is, I would argue, I don't agree with it, but I would think some people, this guy didn't fall on them. So they became less of a priority for them.
I mean, in Western Canada, it's kind of the home of the free trade people. Really, I mean, you look. Originally, we started the New West Partnership. It was called at the time. It was BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, to try and open up trade barriers between just the three provinces. It was a very, very difficult process. But we started with trucking. We started with all those rules, that are just so dumb. When you want to get something from Saskatchewan to the port in Vancouver, you want to really get that figured out. So that's where it kind of began, and we really made a lot of progress on it. But the problem is always that the provincial governments change. And so those provincial governments have a different approach to it. So if you're a government that's captive to, say, public sector unions, then you are not going to be working hard on this, because the teachers in British Columbia and the teachers in Alberta and the teachers in Saskatchewan don't want to be competing with each other. They want to have their own. They want to have complete control over their own unit and be able to not have what they would think of as a race to the bottom in terms of any of the deals that they get. Teachers, I mean, and then the professional associations, doctors, lawyers, they're all a problem. And then you go to premiers and they'll say, well, you know what? I can't do it because they make this specific bus part in my riding, or there's a brewery in my riding. And it becomes, it's amazing how much this very important dialogue gets boiled down to one or two or three little tripping points that might be, the difference between a provincial government getting reelected or not. And that is the problem with interprovincial trade. And my view of it has always been the federal government needs to find a way to come in and really Bigfoot the thing. They need to be aggressive about it.
But I also think, and I've heard this phrase being used a little bit. Sorry to interrupt, but
you're never sorry to interrupt, Steve.
I don't know who was. I don't know who it was who said it, but they're now looking at policy of, instead of how do we respect the skills of individuals who, for example, Kathleen raised the issue of you didn't use this profession, but somewhere where there's scope of practice may be different, but where they're now starting talking about skill competency. So if a government in Canada says you can practice in that particular province or you can work in that particular province, that should be good enough for your for every province.
I agree.
Not necessarily tearing down any more trade barriers. We start linking our skills up. Listen, I'll go. We now have labor mobility in apprentices across the country because you can earn hours in any respective province and bring those hours back to your own province for your apprenticeship. So that didn't happen easily, but it happened because people realized the apprenticeship rules were set up for the 1960s. No one would ever imagine that an Atlantic Canadian would fly to work for 2 weeks and fly home. Well, but we couldn't count any of those hours of work. We banished them to live in Western Canada, no matter if they got a good job at home or not. So there's ways around this, and part of that is respecting what's happening in provincial jurisdictions without having to go through this whole negotiated rigmarole, because eventually it will all come to the common denominator, which is what we want for skill set. If you're a Canadian trained physician, think about this for a minute. Think about this for a minute. If you're a Canadian trained physician, or you have to get permission to operate in Kathleen in Nova Scotia, or if you're an Ontario trained doctor, makes no damn sense, David. You're going to get me swearing, David. It makes no sense, but that's the reality of that's the profession That's the profession, self-regulated, protecting itself. They're still stuck in 1960 around the regulatory piece, in my view.
But there's no public interest in that, Premier.
There is huge public interest in this when you start looking.
No, I'm saying in their position, there's no public interest. So why do you tolerate it?
Well, but I think what you're starting to get is that to break down. But you need the colleges to come, and I agree with. So I think the New West Partnership, where that Christy was talking about, is the model. I really do. I think you don't have this idea that we have to have, every province agree. Find a dance partner. Find someone to work with. Find somebody to manage it out. In Atlantic Canada, it should be the 4 Atlantic provinces continuing to work on what they're doing. As a province, Ontario is a big market. Ontario is, quite frankly, I would argue for Atlantic Canadians, is the market. How do we get access to it? How do we continue to make sure that our workers can go there, our companies can go bid on contracts? And if they belong to the Nova Scotia Compensation Board and we're covering workers through that, then let's not worry about whether they're covered in Ontario, because Nova Scotia will cover them. Our compensation board will cover them if they get injured working in Ontario. Find creative ways around being able to manage this, because I think the longer we go on about this, we're going to realize we're spinning our wheels a lot when we could be marching by, finding certain partners and move forward on it.
Just what you said there, Stephen, about, worker working in Ontario and being covered in Nova Scotia. I mean, you can just hear the debate around that. Like, you don't have to imagine it. You can hear it happening. And I think, David, one of the really telling things about when all of us were in office, one of the telling things about the discussion around interprovincial trade was we considered it a big success that we got agreement on a dispute resolution mechanism, because each one of these issues has layers of challenge that, maybe Stephen and Christy are right. I mean, maybe it has to be a regional dance partner situation, because finding those national common threads, it will take time, which is, to your original question, that's why it's gone quiet.
We signed an agreement with Alberta around this apprenticeship, the hours. It was Jim Prentice's government just before he came in. We had Nova Scotia kids that were going to work in Alberta for 2 weeks at a time or 3 weeks at a time and flying back home. The national ship procurement contract was happening. But if you were a welder who had a job in Alberta and you were stuck in their apprenticeship program, you had to make a choice. Do I leave that apprenticeship program where I'm on block 3 and come back and take a good paying job at Halifax Harbor and start over again in the apprenticeship program? Now think of the logic of that. It makes no sense. Same welder. So there is ways around finding your partner, because, but I don't want to let the private sector off the hook here. I'm telling you, and I'm a private sector guy. For every regulation you see, you can find a private sector person who wants to wrap their arms around it. So that's why you shouldn't do them one at a time.
So sticking with internal divisions and conversations, we're headed toward some pretty serious confrontation, it looks like, between Alberta and British Columbia over a pipeline, because the BC Premier has been absolutely unequivocal that there's not going to be another oil pipeline built through British Columbia, and the Premier of Alberta says it is a matter of national unity that there must be a oil pipeline to the coast, to the west coast of Canada from Alberta. Jesus, Stephen, how do we resolve this?
Well, how about bring the pipeline east? Bring it east. I'm being a bit, but this is always, it doesn't matter what. That's where the national government.
As a country, how do we work this out?
Well, I think that's where the national government is going to have to become a major part in this conversation. I think they're going to have to start making some decisions around our resource development, getting it to Tidewater. We're 2 decades late. We better get up to the dance floor here. I was pleased to hear him talking about Keystone when he spoke to the president recently. That's a positive thing. We know that project's ready to go if we can convince Americans to do it. I wouldn't get too caught up in the one right now that doesn't have a proponent. I think the fact that they've raised it, the Alberta government has raised it, will have the national government trying to build partners and a pathway forward. But I wouldn't overblow the disagreement between the two of them at this point. It's at the very beginning of the conversation, and by the time they get there, who knows in government at the time.
Christy, what's your? I mean, you obviously have been a premier of British Columbia. You also understand the fossil fuel industry, the oil industry really well. What's the deal here?
Well, the deal is, in short, David Eby's government is they're really floundering because I think our population has grown by 25% and our spending as a government has grown by 100%. They really need to create economic growth, and I think they understand that, but they can't figure out how to do it. They don't have a lot of, they have pretty low execution in the government. They don't have a strong, kind of understanding of the resource sector because they haven't been, it hasn't been their position to really support it over the years. So I think you've got a couple of problems here. You've got an NDP government that is totally dependent on a very, very, very strong environmental movement in order to succeed. They've got a minority government. The only way they can get reelected is by continuing to oppose pipelines and those kinds of things. Then beside it, you've got Danielle Smith, and she sounds a little unhinged on some of this stuff, I'm going to say, but I think she's right about it. We do need to find a way to get more pipelines to the coast. So, it's really kind of political priorities. She's on the one hand, she's up to her neck in scandal. She's trying to figure out how to distract from that, but she's also trying to figure out how to get more of Alberta's resources to the coast, which I think is a reasonable thing. So you've got this sort of political side to it between the two of them. But then you've also got in BC, if the EB government doesn't support it, it's not going to happen. The EB government could be replaced sooner rather than later if there's an election. So that's, potentially one upside there, one solution there. What will remain, though, is the First Nations opposition to it along the North Coast and the federal government tanker ban. The more serious of those problems is the First Nations opposition to it up the North Coast. So, you take the Niska, for example, they've got a big LNG project. The Heisla's got a big LNG project. Lots of the other First Nations are engaged in one way or another in LNG, and they see this as sort of upsetting the table amongst their membership, their citizens who don't want to see oil coming across the North Coast. That's going to be a tough puzzle to solve, but I do think it's solvable potentially over time. It's going to take hard negotiation, and the federal government is really going to have to come to the table in a material way. But then there's the federal government tanker ban, which was always like, it was really truly some of the height of Justin Trudeau's performative kind of politics, because you've got all these tankers coming right through the same channel from Alaska down the coast, couple, 3, 4, 5 times a week, shipping heavy oil. And the tanker ban doesn't apply to them. So I think, there's a few problems there. I think that a lot of them are solvable. But again, I think at the end of the day, the biggest obstacle in the way of it is the NDP government, their dependence on the support of the environmental movement in British Columbia. And unless this government is replaced, I think it's going to be really hard to get it done. But again, as I said, I think a majority of British Columbians would support a pipeline through the north of BC, because everybody here understands we have a big, big economic problem on our hands. We need to diversify our economy. And people who once might have said, you know what, we don't really need the money that badly, are now saying, well, wait a minute, here's reality. We've got to figure out how to get Canada's resources to other parts of the world.
As I understand the two arguments, though, and first of all, I just have to say, I have a real bias against anybody that puts the fucking nature of the country on the line for a policy idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's a bullshit way of conducting business in this country. But it feels to me like there is a certain, there's politics on both sides, but I'm convinced that when we send our oil to the States, we sell it at a discount, which is why Keystone isn't really that great an answer, because we're trapped at that lower price that the U.S. pays us. And I'm told that the Trans Mountain Pipeline, once it was operational, actually materially impacted Canada's GDP. That's how much it meant to be able to sell it at the higher world price for oil. So more of that seems like what we need right now. On the other hand, I thought Eby put together a pretty compelling case that he has built a consensus in his province around a lot of things that there wasn't consensus on before, at least among his supporters, that he's gotten people to go along with LNG. And he's gotten this consensus to do the 2 of BC projects are on the major projects list, and BC's ready to do this, but an oil pipeline will crack that consensus down the middle, in his view. So a little bit more from you on this, Christy, and then I'd like to hear from Kathleen on what the national government's role is in a dispute like this.
Well, I think David Eby is a very, very good communicator. He can take an issue and present it in a way that, I think to people in the rest of the country sounds pretty convincing. But he has not found a consensus on this issue at all. And I'm not even sure he has a consensus in his own party. You think about a number of workers, private sector union workers, for example, who benefit from these projects. I mean, the one LNG project, which he opposed and wrote a letter to the federal government asking or demanding that they not approve it, isn't something he built consensus on. He was one of the primary opponents to the thing. We built that consensus and we won an election in 2013 and in 2017 based on LNG. It created 100,000 jobs, most of them unionized jobs, across the country. So, I mean, it's not true he built a consensus around LNG at all. And it's certainly not true that he's found a consensus on anything else related to natural resources. I mean, his consensus in his party is that they oppose any more pipelines through British Columbia for oil. That's the consensus that he's built in his party. And again, public opinion is not, it does not reflect the consensus that he's built within his party, which is a minority government, by the way. Now, there are other pipeline options potentially. If it doesn't go through the North Coast, there is a potential option to do it down the most of the right of way that the new TMX twinning has gone down, and do it down a spur line down through Tawasin so that it's not coming through Burrard Inlet. I mean, there are other options for doing a pipeline, but David Eby's position on it is he opposes any other pipelines through British Columbia. And that is not building national unity. That is not building consensus. I think if he paints any other picture than an opponent of pipelines in British Columbia, he's really trying to put one over on you, David.
Okay.
So,
Kathleen,
yeah.
what would you expect? How would you expect the federal government to help bring us to a resolution here that doesn't end up with a fucking referendum in Alberta?
So, I mean, obviously, I defer to Christy on this. She's got a whole lot more knowledge about this than I do. And I mean, to her point about having built consensus on LNG, I mean, Christy, I don't think we had a conversation when you were premier that you didn't talk about LNG. It was a constant refrain. So you did an enormous amount of work on that. But it seems to me that the federal role, and to Stephen's point, I think it's a really important role that they have to play. And that is to build a different consensus, so that if what Christy is saying, and I believe what you're saying is true, that, that the coalition that Eby has built may not be the same as the provincial public opinion. And I would say, particularly if there's a First Nation conversation that has to be had, it seems to me that Carney's role is to bring those people together and to have that conversation. I don't know Danielle Smith well enough to know whether she actually just wants this fight to go on because it serves her political purpose, or whether she actually wants to find a solution. So I think, in some ways, Carney's role is to call her bluff and to actually work to facilitate a solution that she'd have to be part of. But I just don't know the woman well enough to know whether she actually is interested in that, because
Yeah.
it looks like she really likes this fight to me.
Any thoughts on this, Premier McNeil?
No,
Okay.
I would not want to. I would not want to think that there's a premier in this country doing something for political purposes.
Heaven forfend.
All right, so I want to end because we got to let you go. You're all busy, and I've kept you for too long. But here's the big question in my head, and I want to ask it to the three of you because I think you know the country as well as anybody in Canada does. Let's say this carries on, and they grind down our auto industry, and they grind down our steel and aluminum industries, and they grind down our forestry industry, and Canada's, real incomes in Canada are falling. Canada's measurably getting poorer. Well, do you think we'll hold? Or like what if, between Trump and Vance, this goes on for 3 or 4 years, and then they re-put the 51st state proposition. Does Canada fold or hold in the face of this kind of pressure?
We hold, David.
Yeah.
You sure about that?
I am. I really am. I don't think we're that fragile. The fact that Danielle Smith is standing up and talking about the country will look different or whatever her language was. I just don't think that's where we're going. I think that we share more in common in terms of our identity as Canadians. The elbows up piece, like that was, maybe it was superficial, maybe it was a momentary enthusiastic blip on the screen, but it's rooted in something. It's rooted in a belief that we are our own unique selves, and we have a lot that defines us other than just we're not American. And I think we're in a period of making that concrete, but maybe it's just because I'm old and I don't want to believe that at the end of my life we're going to fall apart, but everything in my heart tells me that we'll hold as a country.
Steve, what do you think? We're being stressed. We're going to get stress tested in a way we've never been stress tested.
Oh, I agree with Kathleen. I do not think that the country would be willing, as a population, to join the U.S. if that's what you're asking. I don't. The country's been through too much already. There are always ups and downs associated with this. The question will be, how do we respond to it? Does the political leadership of the day, can they respond to it the way they did with the financial crisis? How do they respond to it in other crises that we've had? But I listen. Trump really did one thing. He unified the country.
Yeah.
Canadians, even in Alberta, even where there's some talk about joining the states, political leaders of like Jason Kenney is denouncing it. You're seeing that. I just don't see it at all. I think we, though, have to realize there's probably going to be some pain as we transition ourselves. And I think we need to be more open internally to listening to the issues that are happening, that is causing a level of alienation within inside of our own country. Mm-hmm. You talked about LNG earlier. Oil and gas sector was feeling it for the better part of a decade. I think we need to have listened a bit more to that. And how do we respond to that? How do we keep that going? I think Canadians have to fully understand the impact of the auto sector on the Ontario economy and realize that if it continues under the pressure it is, how do we as collectively respond to that? And the same thing in the forestry and and there are ways, in my view, there are ways for us to respond, but we need to collectively do that and have a mature conversation about where is this country going on the go forward. But I don't plan on passing in my passport, David, for another one. I think the one I have is pretty credible around the world. And I think Canadians recognize how valuable this country is around the world, and they'll fight like hell to keep it.
Absolutely.
Well, David, as a Westerner, I can report that there is a lot less, on balance, there is less optimism about Canada and Western Canada. There's no doubt about that. I think this is kind of the hotbed of where the discussion kind of sits in Canada. But I think it's true. I think that both Kathleen and Stephen are completely right. The majority of Canadians still really will believe in Canada, and I don't think we're going to fold. But the federal government's response to this, I think, is going to be really important. And it means that they are going to have to get out there and stoke economic growth. And that means they're going to have to vastly cut regulation in the country to make sure that we get economic opportunity going again. They're going to have to restore our reputation around the world as from being a terrible place to invest to being a good place to invest again. That's also a tremendous task that they're going to take on. And I think they're going to have to really cut back on the areas of government that aren't directly related to social services, to be able to find the money to be able to pay for the infrastructure and the economic growth that we want to try and build in the country. This is no small task. I think it's going to take some time. There's no doubt about it. I do think that Carney is the right guy to do it, though. I mean, people often say to me, gee, they're very polite, it would have been nice if you become leader. And I always say, well, you know what? I think it all turned out okay, because I think Carney is really on the right track. And I think he's got a long-term plan to get it done. It will be painful, but I do think that Canadians, and I'm not placing any bets on Alberta yet today, will remain united enough to be able to withstand a serious economic downturn as a result of all this. But I think it's going to be really, really tough times. And, when I say this, I think specifically about all the men and women that I know who work in forest-based communities. Like, they're talking about closing up shop, moving, finding another place to live, finding a completely another job. Like, they're talking about giving up on their communities and their lives that they've built and the skills that they have and finding something else to do. That's happening all across the country. As a result, those conversations are happening everywhere. And that's a very dangerous place for it to be. So I guess my last comment would be, I think that, when Canadians start getting really angry, and that may happen, that's when Canadians start to elect conservative governments. And that's when Pierre Poilievre starts to look like a very good alternative for people. I don't think he is, but I think if this is badly managed and not done quickly enough, we may end up with a conservative government, which would have a completely different view of how this would unfold. And that's probably the next conversation. That's the conversation you don't want to be having. At least I don't want to be having. And maybe the next kind of the unpredictable element, and impossible to answer part of your question.
It will definitely affect politics. That is for sure. Right.
And if we win the World Series, Stanley Cup, wouldn't that help?
What about the World Cup?
And the World.
You forgot about soccer, Kath.
I don't think we're going to win the World. I don't think we're going to win the World Cup, though. But Edmonton has a chance to win the Stanley Cup, and obviously Toronto is, clearly going to win the World Series. So there you go. Listen, I'm dead certain that this is not a conversation I would have ever anticipated having with you when I met the three of you. But God bless you for coming on here and having it with me, and helping talk me through some of my darker thoughts and depressions. It's great to have you. So again, thanks very much for doing this. Thank you to all the Herle Burly-ites out there who watch or listen to this show, and to our sponsors who make this show possible. I appreciate your support. Thanks very much. See you next week.